So Matt, do you know what I want to talk about now? I think it's time to talk about it.
I don't
The
know.
elephant in the room.
This is awkward.
It's awkward. I think it's time to talk about sin.
Oh, he had to go there.
Yep, it's time to talk about your problems. About venial mortal sin from a Catholic point of view is that venial sin are those sins that lead to sickness, as in First John, which is like swearing and like cheating at Monopoly. And mortal sins are sins that kill grace, which are murder, adultery, idolatry, that sort of thing, which you can all check out on my blog, thelatinright.com. I wrote two articles. I wrote three articles about sin. So
Nice.
um, just waiting for certain friends of mine to read them. Just kidding. Kind of. And anyway, so Matt, what would you say is like a Protestant view on sin? Like, what would you? Because you guys don't view on like sin as mortal or venial. So would you guys commit like all sin is kind of in the same? All sin is sin. Is that what you say?
Well, Protestantism, as you know, is pretty varied. So there's some who would say, yeah, there's, you know, all sins are the same. But I honestly think that's more the lay person, like the lay Protestant. I think when you read scholars and stuff in general, I think they agree that there are maybe degrees or levels of sin. That some sins are worse than other sins. Uh, I don't know offhand any Protestants who would hold to the mortal venial sin distinction, and certainly the things that are attached to that in the Catholic Church, like what happens soteriologically uh, when you commit a mortal sin versus a venial sin. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree, and this is kind of like a side tangent, but a lot of the, you know, in doing my research for my articles, I did read about how the early church dealt with sin,
hmm,
and I think that the Catholic view on sin, and also it shares with the Orthodox. The Orthodox have the same view on sin. There's sins that lead to sickness and sin that lead to death. They don't necessarily call them venial or mortal, but they do have those different types of sins for them.
true.
So the early church developed a system of penance that is kind of, it relates to, the fact that they believed there were certain sins that would separate you from God, and then they would have to devise a system to bring you back,
Hmm.
because they expected you to live a holy life, but not a lot of people lived up to that. Committing adultery and fornication first was a big issue, and then later on, after the apostasy of a lot of them during the persecutions, that was another sin that was huge.
Sure.
So they had to get him back in somehow. So there is the early church had to deal with sin. What I want to talk about mostly is how our current society views sin. Particularly, what I want to address is a kind of online debate I had with a friend of mine regarding abortion. And I know we talked about abortion before, and this topic of abortion in terms of like relating to my gender,
Hmm.
because I know we address that too. Can men talk about abortion? And he basically told me that because I'm a man, I don't have a say in what is discussed about abortion, or if, what women can do with the health of their bodies.
Like you
Like,
can't
it's
even have a conversation about it.
no, I can't even have a conversation about it
Oh,
because I'm not a woman. So
okay.
therefore I don't have, which to me seemed kind of ironic because he's a man telling me, another man, what I can and cannot have a conversation about.
Hmm.
So I actually kind of tongue in cheek said, well, I don't have to listen to you then because you're a man, and therefore your opinion about abortion doesn't matter either.
Yeah.
And he was like, he told me, no, no, you got to read this book from this feminist, Marxist, to expand my view. And what he kind of told me that kind of hit me, and this is kind of leading. I'm getting somewhere. Believe me,
Mm-hmm.
is that he called my thinking binary. That I
Okay.
had binary thinking, and I looked into that, and I was like, what is binary? So I looked up binary thinking in Google, and all these talks I found were about how traditional views on morality, on sin, on those sorts of things, the black and white thinking was kind of an immature way of looking at things, not taking into consideration context and what's going on, which I think was what he was trying to get at, is
Yeah.
that women have situations
Sure.
that they have to deal with. And I'm not against situational ethics. And even in the Catholic theology, there's things where you're saying, listen, if you have a certain pregnancy that is going to cost you your life, the ovum kind of attaches to some place that's not safe for you, and it's gonna kill you.
Yeah. Right.
And
Yeah.
then that procedure is okay, because it's not intentionally killing somebody just out of convenience, or because you just want it. It's because it's a life-saving procedure.
Right. It's a life for a life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My problem is that when you look at this thing from a convenience standpoint, like, and then they broaden out the definition of what is health. It's mental health. So
Right. Right.
therefore, if I feel like I can't afford it, therefore. So I was looking at this and I was like, okay, binary thinking, black and white. So this leads me back to the beginning in the Bible, where you get the first sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to set the stage, set the scenario, you have Eve without Adam, and there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And she's out there without Adam. I don't know where Adam is. He's probably naming animals or something. And all of a sudden, the serpent approaches Eve and says, starts asking her questions about what God told her about eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what stuck with me is the serpent said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, did God really say, or did God truly say
Mm-hmm.
that you should not eat it? And then she's like, well, she said he didn't touch it. So even like after that, she's adding, because God said not that you shouldn't touch it, but just don't eat it. But she started adding, like, no, not always supposed to eat it, but we're not supposed to touch it. So she's adding, because the binary there, right, is God commands you not to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's either eat it or don't eat it. There's a binary, don't do it. She adds to the binary by saying, no, we shouldn't touch it. So did God really say that? Did he really say that you shouldn't eat it? And then he goes into this long, you know, monologue about, if you did it, then God knows you'd be like him, knowing the knowledge of good and evil. So it's actually making you better.
Right. Right.
It's going to make you better if you do this, if you
Right.
disobey and sin. So the first instance of a binary that appears in Scripture is uh, proceeded. Is that what you call it? Proceeded by a non-binary, or
Preceded.
what's the opposite of binary? Um,
Non-binary.
Open-mindedness.
Oh.
An opening of the definition, right? So, I'm not saying that my friend was, is the devil or anything, but I just sort of feel like, especially in our modern culture, is that we see this broadening of a definition and a reaction against a binary. That's saying, if we think that it is black and white, it is actually gray, and that if we, and if we don't see it as gray, then we are children that. And this somebody told me too, is like, you believe this because you were taught by blank so and so, that I was just falling in line because this is how I've been taught. Like, haven't done any research, haven't read any books, haven't read any articles. I just believe it because I'm just a sheep.
Right. Right.
So I think that binary is, equated with being a sheep, and it is equated with not being sophisticated in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, and would you agree that the idea of sin is a binary? That there's, thou shalt not steal means don't steal.
Mm-hmm.
But they would say, wait, what if you're hungry? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or thou shalt not kill, but what if you're defending your family? Or You know what I'm saying? Like there's certain things where, or thou shalt not lie. Well, what if you're hiding like in Germany, people that were hiding Jews? Like, shouldn't you lie there? So how would you respond to that?
Well, I think there's actually a little bit of irony here in that I think the more subtle and nuanced view is the sort of the natural law, the objectivism, that view. The At least what I see in a popular sphere, right, from social justice warriors and stuff, it's some of the most black and white moralistic thinking I've ever seen in my entire life. And I grew up in a charismatic conservative church.
Mm-hmm.
Like these people are like about as dogmatic and about as binary as you can possibly get when it comes to moral proclamations. So, yeah, I think that's at least with that group, right? That's a little strange to hear from them. I don't know if your friend is in that group or not, but that's the kind of group I typically hear those kinds of phrases from. Oh, that's binary thinking. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, there are some things that are either or, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that when it comes to an actual account of morality or an account of first order moral principles or meta ethical principles or frameworks or whatever, it doesn't mean that it's not subtle or nuanced. Not at all. I mean, if anything, the Catholics view especially has a very subtle and nuanced explanations for how what objective morality is, where does it come from, what's the epistemic and ontological grounding for it,
Mm-hmm.
what is how are sins categorized, what are exceptions to those sins, and under what conditions and things like that. Like it's not even a comparison. So yeah, my initial response is that's just ignorant, honestly, to say that if you think first, if you think that there are any binary propositions or any claims that just have either true or false as a truth value, well, that's well, I need more justification. Like, what are you even talking about? I'm not even sure what you're getting at that point because there just are certain claims like that.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't preclude there being a further elaboration on certain principles in the development of your ethics or the development of your meta ethics or in the development of whatever, your ontology. Like all that's, yeah, it's just, I think that's popular level. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to sound posh and cool and with it. So I'm just going to call what you're saying non or like binary or whatever and use it pejoratively. That's kind of, at least again in the popular circles, that's what it seems to be as far as I can tell.
Like, put me in my place. Who are you to talk about this? I'm like, well, who are you to tell me who am I? That's what I want to
Yeah.
say.
The
Like, I'm a human being. I have a mind just as much as you do. So, if you're thinking that there's more than this binary,
yeah.
well, then I guess I'm just part of that spectrum, right? So it's valid. I mean, if your view is valid, then my view is valid. So I don't know, why people who think differently than me and have it, think that they can tell me because I come out with the opinion that is to them extreme, I guess, that I can't have that opinion, but they can have their extreme opinion, which is, if we're just talking about it on an opinion level, I think everybody's entitled to their opinion, but that's not how it works in our culture today. Like opinions, I mean, it's very dogmatic. Um,
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes it, you know, the idea out there is that, like, conservative Christians, especially, are these dogmatic, narrow-minded, very black and white thinkers who can't invoke nuance or anything like that. And gosh, conservative Christians look like extremely thoughtful, sensitive to situations, kind of thinkers in comparison with what we're seeing now with
mhm.
this absolute tyrannical moralism that doesn't admit of any exceptions or any explanation or nuance. Like as soon as you start going into any kind of explanation, or well, maybe it didn't happen that way, or maybe there's another explanation, or maybe we shouldn't condemn the entire person for like sins in a particular area of their life or something like that. Well, then you're evil. You're complicit. You're right. Like it's the most fundamentalist type religion that I've ever seen, and that says a lot. Coming from the conservative Christian background that I have.
And just to talk about how we as Christians, Catholic and Protestants and Eastern Orthodox, you know, I feel like there's a pressure on us to fall in line. But for us, it's not just an issue of uh, of just nuance too, but there's also an issue that we believe in objective truth,
Yeah.
and we're accountable to God, and we have to stand before Him. And I said Him. We're not going to stand before tribunal of the cultural elites at the end of our lives. We're going to stand before God, and we're going to have
Right.
to give account for our lives. And
Yeah.
so, what happens when our culture and we see laws that are passed that are it's kind of getting scary, where you know we're gonna have to take a stand and say, listen, we can't go along with you on this. This is for us an issue of whether or not we are right with God or not, if we're gonna be sinning or not. And I think that is a very, it's not necessarily just something about cultural or situations. It's like, okay, you're getting to a certain point where I can't follow with you. I
Yeah.
can't go with you.
And why doesn't your system allow for something like that? Why doesn't the people who I think we're probably have in mind, right? Why doesn't their system allow for disagreement morally, or further elaboration? Because honestly, for them to well, I shouldn't say that. For us to have some kind of moral conviction and say, look, this is a well reasoned, thought out, well considered moral position, and this is what I hold to. And if you don't like that, if you think I'm wrong, okay, well then let's have a conversation about it. Because I'm willing to talk about it. There may be something that I haven't thought about that I need to take into consideration. And that's what I see from almost every theist that I know of who delves into the topic of ethics, or just is a thoughtful person. Will say something like that. Hey, yeah, well, let's talk about it. Let's come kind of flesh this issue out and see. Maybe there's something you haven't thought of. Maybe there's something I haven't thought of, and let's come to an end. And at the end of it, I'm like, well, we can agree to disagree. That's just not the way it is right now. So it puts us in a really precarious position, because it's like, look, I'm sorry that you don't agree with some moral position that I take, but I literally don't have the right to disagree. I've thought about this quite a bit, and unless you give me good reasons, that reflects that you understand the reasons why I hold this moral position, I feel no obligation whatsoever to capitulate to your uncritical, unthought out moral position. Like, why the heck would I even think about doing that? No, I don't do that. And at a certain point, like, if it's just going to be that, where it's just bashing heads together and where there's no discussion or dialogue or trying to understand each other, it's just you're evil because you believe in a traditional family marriage or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, yeah, I think there's pretty good reasons to hold that, and if you think otherwise, let's talk about it. And if you can talk about it, great. If not, it's like, well, it doesn't matter if you just shout it loud enough, you're not going to change my mind. If you fire me, not going to change my mind. If you put me in jail, it is what it is. You can't just force me into believing something that I don't think is reasonable to believe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the more you try to do that, the more you actually entrench me in my justification. Like, these people are evil. They're wrong, and these are not the kind of people that can be dictating to me what's right and wrong. Anyway, sorry, getting a little bit of
No, that's great, man.
a soapbox.
Preach it. Well, I mean, there's a great movie out there, and for anybody who's never seen it, it's called A Man for All Seasons.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, Thomas More is one of my favorite saints, and I think that if I would go back now to when I was confirmed as a Catholic, because I chose Saint Anselm,
Mm-hmm.
which is weird because I became a Christian. Well, I kind of accepted Christ as my savior. I wasn't baptized till a while later, which is my theology is different now, but was on August 28th, 1988, which is the feast of St. Augustine. So you'd think I would have gone with Augustine, but for some reason I chose Anselm because I was really reading in Anselm at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I chose him. But I think if I'd go back, I'd probably choose Thomas More,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
because he was he was an intellectual. He was he was a traditional humanist, not like a secular humanist, but a
Mm-hmm.
Christian humanist. And and the thing is he died for a conviction that we would say today would be like, why would you put yourself on the line like that? Like, why,
Right. Yeah.
all we had to do was say, fine, Henry, you can marry, fine, your first marriage to Catherine is void, and now you can marry Anne Boleyn. Fine.
Mm-hmm.
And he would be in he was the second, he was the most powerful man in England as a chancellor at the time, and he would be fine. But he said, listen, there's one scene that always sticks with me, and I may include it in this episode, but he's standing and he's in prison, and he's brought before one of his friends who decided to do what he told Thomas to do, is like just capitulate. And he's brought in and he said, Thomas, please, for friendship's sake, sign this, save yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then Thomas is like, he said, now listen, you went with your conscience, which, when we stand before God, that will justify you. He said, but if I go against my conscience and I stand before God and he sends me to hell, will you come with me to hell for friendship's sake?
Right.
It was like, wow, that is so powerful.
Yeah.
And he decided to stick with his conscience and say, listen, no matter what they do to me, I cannot go against my conscience. I can't do it. And we wouldn't expect that of them or anybody else to go against their conscience. If that's truly where they're at, then that's where they're at. But they should accept you know, our conscience and where we're at, and that we can't, there's a certain point we can go with them, but then at this point that, we can't go any further. And we should be able
Well,
to be that way. We should be able to have that freedom.
yeah, and I think your narrative about Thomas More is really interesting in when talking about sin, because people can talk a lot about like evil and good and that kind of thing, but sin seems to have a distinctively theological context, right? That there's some wrong being done um, against a deity, right? Like because you can sin against other people, but there's some sense, at least in some theological circles, that sin is first and foremost against God. That there's some kind of offense being carried out when you sin that offends God. So it's not merely that you're not going to enjoy life as much, or that you just won't get the benefits out of living a life of virtue or whatever. It's
Mm-hmm.
also that you're offending the mind, the intellect, the will, the love that created you, and designed you to be a certain way. And when you're not that way, it's disappointing to that being.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, sin, I think that notion carries with it sort of a theological context, or is couched, at least couched in a theological context that is a little bit distinct from even just good and evil per se. And but I think without that context, without that theological context, you lose a lot if you just think about things as good or evil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kind of trying to tie that back to
Yeah.
our initial conversation about sin. Uh, and really fundamentally, that is like, there is this God who I love and want to please. And that's more important to me than whatever consequence that we have or whatever you tell me. Like, it's not that I don't also love people, but God is primary. God has the primacy in my decision making and in my moral action. And anyway, sorry.
In your affection,
Right.
like that
Yes.
you love. I mean, and that's what we talk about too when going back to the, the fact that God's going to write that law on our heart.
Mm-hmm.
And what that law is, when Jesus talked about the two greatest commandments are love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
If you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and your neighbor as yourself, you wouldn't sin.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do it.
Yes.
Because, whenever you sin, it's basically not loving those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Really. And, without a theological context, it sounds silly to say things like, fundamentally, your problem with your, let's say, your moral structure is fundamentally a problem with your relationship with God. And that's something that popular Christians, you hear in popular Christianity a lot, but in theological circles as well. Like, there is something fundamental that's broken when we sin, right? I
Hmm.
mean, you can talk about maybe, well, it's because your view of the hierarchy of goods has gotten inverted or wrong, and that's why you see these goods as higher than those goods. Um, or maybe like there's this, without the, you can talk about it in terms of the grace of God, right? Like, you don't have the grace of God, the certain grace of God working in and through you to produce um, virtue. Certainly not the theological virtues, but really fundamentally, it does seem like there's this sin, this evil, this distortion of the fallen world is fundamentally a fracture in the relationship between humanity and God. And that, I think, is why people right now don't like to talk about sin, because it harkens back to that truth. So when we talk about sin rather than just evil.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think too with our culture, I think obviously they redefined what a sin is, because sin is no longer that which takes away from what is good in terms of like the traditional understanding of what is good, but it's kind of like taking away from what I want to do and how I want to actualize myself. It's all about the individual and what they think is right, and then those individuals kind of group together and they have a group understanding what's right and wrong and what a sin is. And then also, I mean, there's grace in on the God traditional side. There's, like you said, there's forgiveness, there's grace, and from a Catholic point of view, there's confession and absolution. But
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah.
in our current culture, the sins that they have defined, if they are violated, it is anathema. It is excommunication. It is you are now sent out to the wilderness, and not even Godspeed, but just we hope you die. Like that. That's it. That is the state of things,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
which
And
is which is such a. I mean, I for me, if you want to look at what side is more humane and more human, look at the side that has more grace. Look at the side. What society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where you have forgiveness and grace and compassion, or do you want to live in a society where you take one step out of line, one foot out of line, and you basically are now cut off from society? Which, I listen to Ben Shapiro and those guys, and they talk about it being like the new Puritans.
yeah, only like without the long period of time of development of that thought, right?
Hmm.
Like, even the Puritans, I had notions of grace and had a much more robust sort of religion than what's happening now. And again, and when we talk about this, right, we're talking about a certain sector of, let's say it, the left.
Hmm.
There's a certain sector of the left that is not. There's not really even much of a conversation to be had with them because they're essentially a cult. Like they're not even. This isn't really just some ideological difference. It's very much like a religion, like a cultic religion. That's the group of people that I'm specifically referring to. But unfortunately, that group has gotten more and more influence and sway in our culture. Uh, how long is that going to last? I don't know. But obviously, I think we're talking about the same thing in terms of the thing that we're concerned about and the thing that we think is pretty seriously problematic. Because I think there are non-Christians, there are people not even in any major religious tradition who maybe have some individualistic view of sin, right? And have some kind of surrogate notion of grace or some pseudo notion of grace or something like that. But
Some residual from their Christian culture.
yes, and how could you not? I mean, the West,
Yeah.
it just is a Judeo-Christian culture. And that's, I think, why you see so much of the contemporary issues we see in divisions that we see are those who want to uphold that Judeo-Christian culture and those who recognize that the Western culture is the result of Judeo-Christian culture and want to destroy it and replace it with something else.
Hmm.
You know, people might think that that's a bit overstated to say that, but there really just are people who want to do that, who want to get rid of Western culture to paint it as completely evil. And I think the ones who are more well read and more well studied in that area, I think they know who they're trying to destroy. They are trying to not just destroy Western culture, but the Judeo-Christian, I don't want to say worldview per se, but
Hmm.
foundations of Western civilization really are the things that are most opposed to what they're trying to do, and they know that.
Yeah.
Um, so
And I was surprised too. Like you said, you made it say like it's on the left, but we're not talking about this as like a liberal and conservative thing because there are a lot of people who are classically liberal on the left
yeah,
that are like, hey man, listen, this is not. I mean, I listened to Bill Maher last week and
yeah,
he made really good points. Like he made
yeah,
really good points. And kind of
yeah.
what was funny is that when he's talking to his panel, he's like, listen, please don't make me sound like Tucker Carlson on this on this topic. No, I think he was talking to Megan Kelly,
Okay.
and he's like, "Please don't make me sound like Tucker Carlson." But you basically are making me to sound like Tucker Carlson by doing these things,
Yeah.
which I think is really good. I mean, that's like for me, that's a good sign. That is something to where like say, listen, we can rational, intellectual kind of people who look and see the problem here. We can come together across those lines. It's not like a left and right thing. It's just a classically liberal person, like I said, like Bill Maher, we are in total agreement.
Right.
So, and we can agree on that. And I think too, Bill Maher, he may not accept it. I mean, he wrote that book, did that thing, Religulous or whatever you call it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he's very like anti-Christian. But and maybe he doesn't understand the fact that he is his righteous indignation towards these things or whatever he talks about is a holdover from his culture that he's learned from. So he's not out of that sphere either. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, people like Naomi Wolf, like uh, you've got who are the new atheist guys who are working with conservative Reformed Christians against kind of woke culture. Darn, I can't remember their names offhand. Anyway, I made James Lindsay and another guy, but anyway, they are. There's a whole website of called I think it's New Discourses, and these people are not friends of conservative Christianity, right? But they
Mhm.
see this, they see what's going on with this woke culture stuff, and they're just like, guys, this is dangerous. Like this isn't. We're not playing around. Like we don't like Christians, but this stuff is way more dangerous than Christianity.
Yeah.
When people like that are trying to warn conservative Christians because they're worried about conservative Christianity being destroyed from the inside out because of it, uh, yeah, if you don't listen to that, it's kind of on you when things go south. Like, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's the modernists, really. The people who don't necessarily associate with a religion but still have a very modernist enlightenment mindset, uh, are just as opposed to this stuff as conservative Christians, maybe for different reasons, some of the same reasons, I think, but even some for different reasons. uh, yeah.
Yeah, it should be said too that, a lot of a lot of this issues that we're seeing now came out of, like, feminism. And the feminists now are like, okay, okay, we've gone too far. They're like,
Yeah.
back it up, back it up. And the thing is, they need to understand too their culpability in all this. Once Christianity fractured in the 16th century, and that kind of led to the Enlightenment, which led to modernism, which led to post. There is a chain of events here,
Hmm.
that when you abandon, when you turn your back on God and what God has deemed to be good, there are consequences, and we're living in the kind of the fruition of all that, um, in our culture today. So, um,
And
yeah,
to some degree, we've been, I mean, since the fall, right? Like, we've been living with the consequences of our fallenness, right? Like, some of the tragedies and atrocities that occurred in the ancient world, are horrific,
hmm
by any day's standards. But this just seems to be kind of the spirit of the age in our time. Every generation, every age of Christians, every group of Christians throughout the ages, I should say, has had to deal with a different spirit of the age. This is ours. Ours is this kind of postmodern, neo-Marxist, kind of woke stuff, and yeah, they kind of declared themselves to be the priests and priestesses of a new religion, and now Christianity's got to figure out how to deal with that.
yeah. Well, I think it's important us talking about sin, like you said, because my appeal to Christians is that we are constrained by our faith to call a duck a duck,
Yep.
and that if we feel like we need to, um, you know, cow to the, I guess, wokeists, um, in order um, to not feel the heat, then we have to realize where that puts us with God.
Right.
Not that you're supposed to be bold and go out there and put your family at risk and stuff like, and those sort of things, but when the time comes, will we be a Thomas More, or will we be his friend, you know,
Right.
who tries to appeal to him like, hey, come on, just for friendship's sake, just give in. I
Right.
hope that we
Right.
have the courage to say, when I'm standing for God and you're good with your conscience, but I'm not, and then will you follow me, accompany me into hell for friendship's sake?
Right.
So I think that's not something we can honestly say to our community, because we have a Christian, we have a community. So I mean, I'm talking to Christians here, not to those outside.
Mm-hmm.
So, in closing, I want to say that this was not in the movie A Man for All Seasons. I wish it was, but one of my favorite quotes from Thomas More is when he's about to be beheaded. And I don't know if you know this, but while he was in prison, they didn't give him shaving instruments, so he grew a long beard, right? Um, and I think it was kind of made down to mid chest or whatever. And so when he brought up, he went to the chopping block. He told the executioner, "Hold on a second, let me put my beard like on the outside of the chopping block, because I grew this in prison, and at least this part of me never offended Henry VIII, so it shouldn't hit be harmed harmed by the axe."
Hmm.
so so even at the end of his life, he made a joke about his facial hair. He's like, hey, listen, this part of me is like totally innocent, so let me just put it over
Yeah.
This part of me never offended Henry, so let me just put that. I just think that was such uh, a great. His conscience was clear.
And that's a true hero, and that's the kind of thing that we need nowadays: are real heroes, not pseudo heroes. Uh, yeah, a Thomas More is someone that can be looked up and admired. William Wilberforce, admirable, right? Real heroes who spent their whole life developing a certain kind of character and quality of person. That made them live an entire life well. Are they perfect? Obviously not. No one's perfect, but
No.
we need these kinds of good examples in order for us to strive to something like that. That's actually part of why I think sin is so prevalent, is when we don't have good examples of how should we live, because I think we learn morality this way, is through example in large part. uh, so when we don't have those good examples, those exemplars, and when Hollywood, for example, wants to get rid of too goody two shoes type of heroes and make them complex characters so that
Mm-hmm.
they're not any better than I am, really. If anything, they might even be worse, which is terrible. Uh, you're seeing that broadly speaking with in Amazon Prime and Netflix, where there just aren't real heroes. We need that.
Yeah, and the thing is, I'm a huge superhero fan. Like my favorite hero is Superman,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that Zack Snyder kind of tried to make it dark, but still kept his essence. That he was for the right and
Mm-hmm.
for but I will not. I just can't bring myself to watch The Boys on Amazon. I just feel like it's not it's not a hero show. It's not there's no hero's journey. There's no there's no Campbell there. Um,
So I
which I think inspires us to be better.
and I did watch that series, but it wasn't because I was. I mean, and I get what you're saying. Like, I didn't watch it because I was looking for inspiration. I wanted to see, like, what is going on with this trend of turning heroes really dark. And man, it doesn't get much darker than heroes, or than I'm sorry, than The Boys.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think there's another one, like Young Superman. There's like a movie where the young Superman is evil. Like, what would it be
Oh
like?
yeah, wasn't that? Yeah, I can't remember where that was. The little kid with the mask, has the
Yeah,
glowing eyes.
yeah.
Yeah,
The
Burn Bright. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, or Brightburn, something like that.
Brightburn. Yeah,
Yeah, where the good character is evil. That stuff is so prevalent now. It's at least complex characters. It's almost hard to find something where there's a good character. I watch those though because for more sort of the moral psychology that underlies it.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, anyway.
And if we're recommending movies too about morals and sin and all that, there's a movie that I've been probably going to watch again tonight before I go to bed. Is The Count of Monte Cristo
Mm,
with Jim Caviezel, and that movie has such great lines about sin, about evil done, and revenge, and grace, and forgiveness, and
mm,
I would recommend that book too, and that book. I've read that book too, but rent the movie.
yeah,
So it's a very good story as well. But Matt, thanks a lot for you know fleshing this out with me. Like I said, I've been having a lot of thoughts about it and conversations, and I thought it would be good to address it, just to talk about sin and the kind of what the Christians have to deal with in terms of just with the culture, but also what does it mean for us to
sure.
not call it what it is.
Yep, sure. Yeah, thank you.
All right, Matt. Have a good one, man.
You too, man.